All right, so we're going to dive into a period of English history that I think is really fascinating.
Okay.
But it's often overlooked, you know?
Yeah.
We're talking about the English Republic,
Oh, yeah.
the 1650s.
Yeah.
Imagine England. No monarchy, the crown literally melted down. The country is grappling with this massive shift in power and identity. You know, it's a story full of intrigue, radical ideas, and all these unexpected twists and turns.
It's amazing, really, how this period often gets kind of overshadowed, by the English Civil War, right? The
Yeah.
big dramatic events that came before it.
Right.
But this is where we see, I think, the real consequences of that conflict.
Yeah.
This is where the ideas that were sort of simmering during the war, they really erupt into the open.
Exactly. Yeah. And
Hmm.
to guide our deep dive into this turbulent decade, we're going to be drawing insights from a really captivating conversation
Okay.
between historians Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook, along with Anna Key, who wrote The Restless Republic, Britain Without a Crown.
Yeah. It's a great book.
Yeah. And it's a conversation that really sheds light, I think, not just on, the big political players, but also on the everyday lives of people who are trying to, figure out how to live in this new world.
And what's striking, right from the start is this sense of like improvisation. Yeah. Just making it up as they went along. The execution of Charles I in 1649 was a rushed affair, really fueled by radical factions in Parliament.
Right?
And you know what? A lot of MPs were actually opposed to it,
Oh, wow.
which tells you a lot about, well, the lack of consensus on, what should come next.
Yeah, so you have this situation, the king is gone,
Yeah.
and there's just this void at the center of power.
Yeah.
And what follows is, well, you can imagine chaos, pure chaos.
Oh, absolute chaos. Parliament already tilting towards, pretty radical ideas, clashes with the army, which is even more radical. So you get weeks of these intense power struggles.
Oh, yeah.
Both sides vying for control of, England's future.
It's like this political pressure cooker.
It really is.
Right. You have all these anxieties, ambitions, everything just bursting forth.
Exactly.
And in the midst of all this turmoil, somehow they managed to abolish the House of Lords and declare England a commonwealth, essentially a republic, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's worth pausing here for a second just to think about what that really meant for people at the time.
Oh, absolutely.
We're talking about a fundamental shift in how they understood, their relationship to power, to authority, to the very structure of society.
And that shift, it created all these different responses.
Right.
On the one hand, you have these groups like the Diggers,
Right.
led by Gerard Winstanley, coming out of this upheaval with radical vision, transformational visions, really.
Yeah, Winstanley's such a fascinating figure, Here's a man advocating for communal living, for the abolition of private land ownership.
Wow.
I mean, basically, it's agrarian communism.
Yeah.
Centuries before, Marx and Engels,
Right.
he had this vision of this utopian society, everyone sharing the land, sharing its fruits.
I mean, his ideas were incredibly radical for the time, even unsettling, I think, to some of the people who had supported the revolution, right?
Yeah.
It highlights the complexities within the Republican movement itself.
It's like this microcosm of the bigger tensions, right?
Yes.
That are playing out all across the country. You have some people like Winstanley who saw this as an opportunity to reshape society from the ground up. And then you have others who are clinging to the familiar,
Yeah.
Yearning for that stability of the old order.
And that desire for stability, that wanting to get back to a sense of normalcy, that's a real theme, I think, that runs through this whole period.
Oh, yeah.
Remember, England had just come out of years of this brutal civil war. People were exhausted, traumatized, desperate for some kind of security.
Right. Exactly. And then against this backdrop, you have figures like Charlotte, the Countess of Derby, staunch royalist. She's defying the Republic from her stronghold on the Isle of Man. She just embodies that resistance to change, that unwavering loyalty to the monarchy.
She's a compelling figure. The Countess of Derby. She represents a whole segment of society that they just couldn't accept the reality of a republic. It's a reminder that even in the face of these sweeping changes, there are always those who hold on to the past.
It's a fascinating dynamic.
Yeah.
You have these extreme positions on both sides, right? You have the radical visionaries like Winstanley, the diehard traditionalists like the Countess.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the majority people who are just caught in between,
Yeah.
just trying to navigate this new reality as best they can.
And for the new republic, I mean, that navigation was full of challenges. I mean, one of the biggest was money. They were basically bankrupt,
Right.
having, inherited all the debts and financial instability of the previous regime.
So what do? Did they just print more money? Debase the currency? I mean, that
Uh,
seems to be the go-to,
well,
right?
they came up with this rather, I don't know, ingenious plan, you could say, or ruthless, I mean, depending on your perspective. They targeted the group that represented, the old order, the royalists.
Okay, so how did that work?
They came up with a system where they would confiscate royalist estates, grant a small portion back, and then charge these huge fines to get the rest back.
Oh, wow.
It was a pretty clever way to replenish the treasury and weaken their political opponents all at the same time.
It's resourceful, I guess, but also speaks to that pragmatism,
Oh, yeah.
that you often see with revolutionary regimes.
Yeah.
I mean, they needed money to operate. They were willing to take drastic measures to get it.
And that pragmatism, it shows up in the actions of individuals, too. Like, take Marchmont Needham, for example.
Okay.
He was a newspaper editor. He seamlessly transitioned between royalist and Republican stances, just depending on, who was in power at the time.
Classic example of someone trimming their sails to the prevailing winds.
Right.
Makes you wonder how much of people's loyalty during this period was genuine conviction versus just, wanting to survive.
Yeah. It's a question that's, well, impossible to answer definitively, but it's one that Kay's book keeps bringing up. Makes us reconsider what political allegiance really meant in such a time of upheaval. Was it ideology, self-preservation, or some mix of both?
Yeah, it's easy to focus on, the big political dramas at the top.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember, I think, that for most people, life just went on.
It did.
They were trying to make ends meet, raise their families, just find some sense of normalcy amidst all the turbulence.
Kay really emphasizes that. This wasn't just a political revolution, it was a social and cultural one as well. And for many, the desire for stability, just a chance to get on with their lives, that was, I think, paramount.
But of course, that desire for stability was always being disrupted
Oh, yeah.
by these ongoing power struggles, right?
Within the Republic itself, exactly.
Yeah. And this brings us to the rise of a figure who would come to dominate the political landscape. Oliver Cromwell.
Yes.
Cromwell's emergence as this dominant force, I think, is really where the story takes this fascinating turn.
He really embodies both the ambitions and the contradictions of this era.
Oh, yeah.
A deeply devout man, believed he was, carrying out God's will, yet he wasn't afraid to use force to get what he wanted.
Yeah.
Complex and ultimately, I think, tragic figure.
Yeah. And his rise, I think, it's inextricably linked to that radicalism and instability that had been simmering ever since the king's execution. It's like the revolution unleashed all these forces it couldn't control, and Cromwell, in a way, becomes the embodiment of those forces.
Cromwell, though, his rise, it wasn't without its critics.
Oh, of course, yeah.
He was a polarizing figure, even among those who had, supported the Republic.
Right.
Some people saw him as a savior, a strong leader who could bring order to the chaos. But others saw him as a tyrant in the making, someone who had betrayed the very principles of the revolution that he'd helped lead.
It's fascinating, right? He really embodies this tension, like this push and pull between wanting stability, but also fearing authoritarianism. And then, of course, he comes to power in 1653 by dissolving Parliament.
Yeah.
I mean, that was seen by some as, maybe a necessary step to curb its excesses.
Yeah.
But it also raised these serious concerns about his own ambitions,
Exactly. And this tension, this is perfectly illustrated, I think, by the story of Anna Trapnell,
Right.
who was she was a young woman from a humble background who becomes like a folk prophet during this time.
Oh, wow.
So picture, London in the 1650s, this city, it's buzzing with religious fervor and political intrigue.
Right.
Trapnell starts having these intense prophetic visions, which she describes in this really vivid, poetic language.
So was she a genuine visionary? Or was she like a shrewd political operator? And how did her role, how did that challenge the traditional gender roles at the time, especially in such a tumultuous environment?
Well, those are great questions, and they're ones that, historians are still debating.
Yeah.
But what we know for sure is that her visions resonated with a lot of people who were very unsettled by Cromwell's growing power.
I bet.
She has this one vision of Cromwell expelling members of Parliament.
Right.
And it happened just a few days later.
Wow, that's chilling.
Chilling coincidence, so it's no wonder people saw her as this this divine messenger,
I
confirming their fears about Cromwell.
Yeah, and I mean, there was even, I remember reading about this, like a group of anti-Cromwell MPs took her on this tour of Cornwall, hoping to use her popularity to stir up opposition.
They did, but it ultimately backfired.
Oh, wow.
And Trapnell ended up in prison. But her story, I think, it shows the power of belief and how it could be used in politics,
Right.
especially in this era.
Yeah, and it also speaks to the anxieties, right, that were surrounding Cromwell's rule. I mean, even he, with all his, military might, political power, couldn't escape the influence of these beliefs, these prophecies. It's almost like Shakespearean, this idea of this powerful leader being haunted by the whispers of this, seemingly insignificant woman.
It's a reminder that power, even in its most absolute form, it's always contingent. It's always, open to challenge, whether it's political rivals, religious dissentients, or even popular prophets like Trapnell.
Yeah. And we shouldn't forget that Cromwell himself was deeply, deeply religious.
Of course, yeah.
I mean, we talked earlier about how he saw that military defeat in the Caribbean as a sign of, God's displeasure.
Right, he did.
This wasn't just political posturing.
No.
It came from his core beliefs. And those beliefs, really informed his whole approach to governing. He saw himself as having this mission to build a more godly society. And that led to, I think, some of the most contentious debates of his rule.
Like should he become king?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Would that bring stability, or would it be, a betrayal of the revolution?
It's a question that must have weighed on him so heavily.
Oh, it did.
On the one hand, you have the crown,
Yeah.
It offers legitimacy, a sense of continuity. But then on the other hand, it represented everything he had fought against.
Yeah. It was a real dilemma.
Yeah.
And Cromwell, he really agonized over it. But in the end, he refused the crown. Maybe he saw it as too closely tied to the tyranny that he'd overthrown, but his refusal didn't really solve the underlying tensions.
Of course not, no.
He was still struggling to balance, the demands of Parliament, the demands of the army, and his own vision for this godly commonwealth.
So what happens when Cromwell dies?
Well, there's this brief and rather kind of pathetic attempt to continue the Cromwell dynasty.
Okay.
His son Richard, he takes over, but he is just completely unsuited for the role. Imagine, suddenly being thrust into this position, the most powerful position in the land.
Right.
Having to navigate all these political factions, these competing interests, but without the experience, without the charisma of your father.
Yeah, it seems almost inevitable that he would fail.
It really does. And he is quickly ousted, which leads to even more instability and uncertainty. And at this point, the question becomes, was the restoration of the monarchy, was it inevitable? Had the Republican experiment just run its course?
So, I mean, where does England go from here? Does it just descend into further chaos?
This is where General George Monk, he comes into the picture. He was a seasoned military leader, and he had actually been a supporter of the Republic. He's up in Scotland watching all this unfold. And he decides, he has to do something.
So does he march on London to seize power himself?
Well, not quite. He marches south with his army, but not to install himself as some kind of, dictator,
Right.
but to restore Parliament. He believed that Parliament, not the army, not any single person, should have ultimate authority.
It's interesting, right?
Yeah.
A man who was so instrumental in dismantling the monarchy, now trying to save the Republic by restoring parliamentary rule.
It's almost like he's trying to rewind the clock, to get the experiment back on track before it completely falls apart.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But here's where things get even more unexpected.
Okay.
Monk's wife, and she enters the picture.
Okay, so who was Anne Monk? What role did she play in all of this?
She's a fascinating figure, really. She came from humble beginnings. She was a laundrywoman when she met Monk.
Wow.
But she was sharp, she was politically astute, and importantly, she was a staunch royalist.
Oh, so she's the one who kind of puts the idea in Monk's head about restoring the monarchy.
That's what people believe, yeah.
She sees the restoration as the best way to achieve stability. And it seems like she had a lot of influence on her husband's decision-making. It's a reminder that even in these, huge historical events, these personal relationships, these behind-the-scenes conversations, they can really have a decisive impact.
It's amazing how history can hinge on these, seemingly small details. What if Monk hadn't had Anne there, pushing him towards a different path.
It's an interesting thought. And as we'll see in the final part of our deep dive, the restoration of the monarchy, it wasn't just a return to the old ways. It was shaped by everything that had happened in that tumultuous decade. A decade that really changed the landscape of English politics and English society.
Okay, so 1660. The English Republic, this experiment in self-governance, it's over.
Yeah.
Charles II, he's invited back, the monarchy's restored. And it seems like, on the surface at least, England's just gone back to the old ways. But, I mean, we've seen throughout our deep dive, things are never that simple.
Oh, absolutely not. The restoration wasn't just hitting some reset button,
Right.
The events of the 1650s, I mean, they left a mark on the country, on the institutions, on the people. You can't just erase that.
Oh.
The decade of Republican rule, it unleashed these ideas, these forces that you just couldn't easily contain, even with the king back on the throne.
It's like trying to put a shattered vase back together.
Yeah.
You might be able to glue the pieces back into, I don't know, some semblance of their original form.
Yeah.
But the cracks are still there.
Yeah.
It'll never be quite the same.
That's a great analogy. I mean, the English Republic, okay, might have been short-lived, but its influence, I mean, it went way beyond those 10 years. It really planted the seeds for concepts that would keep shaping England's future, even under the monarchy.
So what were some of those lasting impacts? What are those echoes of the Republic that we can still see today?
Well, one thing is, I think, the seeds of religious toleration. The Republic, I mean, it really grappled with this question,
Yeah.
how do you accommodate all these different faiths in one nation?
Right.
And, okay, maybe they didn't achieve full religious freedom.
Right.
But the debates, the experiments of this period, they laid the groundwork for what came later.
Yeah, it's crucial, right? They were forced to confront the limits of imposing a single religious orthodoxy
Exactly.
on a population that was diverse.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was messy, it was contentious, but it pushed the country towards more tolerance.
Another impact, I think, is this growing idea of a unified Great Britain. The Republic, for a while at least, it brought England, Scotland, and Ireland under one government. And even though that union, it dissolved with the Restoration, the idea was there.
Right.
And eventually it would come back.
It's fascinating, right? I mean, these ideas, unified Britain, religious tolerance, they seem so fundamental to how we understand Britain today.
They do.
But they were really forged in this really tumultuous period.
Yeah, and maybe the most significant legacy, I would say, is this debate about parliamentary sovereignty.
Okay.
The struggle between parliament and the monarchy.
Yeah.
The thing that led to the Civil War in the first place, it didn't just end with Charles I's execution.
Right.
It kept going, in different forms throughout the Republic.
Yeah.
As different factions argued over where the ultimate power should lie.
So the Republic didn't really answer that question definitively, but it did force this national conversation, right?
It did.
About the limits of royal authority,
Yeah.
the potential for a more participatory form of government.
Exactly. And even though the monarchy came back, the king's power, I mean, it was really diminished.
Yeah.
Charles II, he returned to a very different England
He did.
than the one his father had ruled. He couldn't just ignore what had happened.
Like the Republic served as this cautionary tale,
Yeah.
a reminder that even kings, they have to govern with the consent of the governed, right?
Yeah, and that awareness, I think it shaped Charles II. He was much more cautious, I think, than his predecessors.
Right.
He had to balance those who wanted the old ways with the reality of a society that had been through a revolution, a republic.
It makes you think, what if things had gone differently? What if Cromwell had, I don't know, chosen a better successor?
Yeah.
What if Monk hadn't marched on London? Could it have survived?
Those are the questions that keep historians up at night. And
Yeah.
and they remind us that history, it's not this straight line.
No.
It's choices, contingencies, individuals caught up in these huge forces. And sometimes these small decisions can have these huge unintended consequences.
And in the case of the English Republic, I mean, those consequences, they're still shaping us today.
They are.
It's a period that really challenges, I think, what we think we know about English history.
Yeah.
And it makes us think differently about power and authority, about tradition and revolution, about the will of the people versus the machinations of the powerful.
And those are questions, I mean, they're just as relevant today.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we're still dealing with them,
Yeah, absolutely.
trying to find that balance, individual liberty and order, the role of religion, the push and pull between those who want to keep things the same and those who want change.
So, I mean, what does all this mean for us, for our listeners today?
Well, I think the story of the English Republic, it's a powerful reminder. Even the most, I don't know, entrenched systems of power, they can be challenged. Revolutions can have these unintended consequences. And the search for a more just society, it's ongoing. It requires us to pay attention, to be willing to question the stories that we've inherited.
Yeah, it's a story that I think resonates with our times, as we think about democracy, representation, power.
Yeah.
It encourages us to think critically about our own systems, our own assumptions, and to recognize that the change is possible, even when it seems impossible.
And if you're interested in this part of history, in this sort of hidden chapter, I really recommend you check out Anna Key's book, The Restless Republic. You might be surprised what you learn about this period, and maybe even about our own time.
And that concludes our deep dive into the English Republic. We hope you enjoyed this journey through one of history's most fascinating and often overlooked periods. It's been a real pleasure exploring this with you.
And remember, the past, it's never really past. It's always there, whispering to us, offering insights, challenges, things to help us navigate our own present.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.